Hi, and welcome back to SDRTK. Today I have a step-by-step tutorial so that you can set up your Scarlett, Clarett, or Clarett Plus interface to work with your DAW, streaming software, outboard gear, as a standalone preamp, or even as an outboard digital to analog converter. So let's check it out. Focusrite Control is the application that comes with Scarlett, Clarett, and Clarett Plus interfaces that allows you to manage the inputs and outputs of your device, as well as controls that don't have physical buttons on the interface themselves. And in addition to managing the I/O and controls of your interface, Focusrite Control takes care of USB driver updates, firmware updates for the interface. You can configure the sample rate that's being used, and it includes a full analog and digital mixer that lets you look after things like external ADAT digital sources, other outboard gear, and really customize the configuration so that it works best with your DAW or other use case. In this video, I'll briefly explain how to install Focusrite Control and the Focusrite Settings app. That's when you first get your interface. Then we'll get right into Focusrite Control itself. I'm going to go through the features and controls in both the input and output settings. We'll take a look at some of the pre-configured setups as far as how the routing is going to work, and Focusrite has included a number of them to help you basically with the most common setups, but we'll also go through a fully customized setup so you can see how to tailor things to exactly the gear that you have. Now for this tutorial, I'll be using a Scarlett 8i6, and I think that's a good mid-ground because whether you're using a Solo, 2i2, 4i4, even an 18i20, you'll have a different number of inputs and outputs, and also different options as far as digital ADAT and mixing control. Now I'll be making a second part to this tutorial using a Clarett Plus 8 Pre to demonstrate some of the advanced features in Focusrite Control. Now I'll be using a Windows platform for this tutorial, but whether you have Windows, Mac, or even using the iPad version of Control, it'll work the same way. And so when you first get your interface and plug it in via USB, what'll happen is your system will recognize it as an external drive, and there'll be a Getting Started link. And so when you click that, what it's going to do is connect to the Focusrite website. It'll let you register. You can update firmware, get the latest drivers, and it'll also help you install Focusrite Control as well as the Settings app. Now, if you don't want to use the Getting Started app, you can always go ahead and hold down the phantom power button for 5 seconds on the interface, and it'll take it out of that out-of-the-box mode and put it into interface mode. Now, check your interface manual if you don't have an 8i6 because the option to do this may work a little bit differently. Then you have the option to go ahead and manually download Focusrite Control and install it. It'll still take care of USB driver updates, firmware updates. It's just another way to get started. So now let's go ahead and open up the application. Now I've also opened up the General Device Settings tab here, and I just wanted you to see that I have my settings at 48,000 Hertz as a sample rate. And that generally is what most recordings are made in today. It allows for frequency response up to 24,000 Hertz. So that should be more than sufficient for what anyone needs. There are higher sample rates available if you really want to get up into some frequencies that, quite frankly, most of us can't hear. But nonetheless, 48 kilohertz is what most studios record in today. There's also a buffer size setting. I have mine set at 128. And essentially what this amounts to is it influences the amount of latency you're going to have in the recordings, and you need to balance this between CPU usage as well as potential for crackle or static. If you're noticing that you have static or crackle on your system, increase the buffer size, and that should help take care of it. And every system is different, so I can't tell you a one-size-fits-all. This is running on an AMD 5900X, so we've got a fair amount of processing power available here. But depending on your system, you may need a little bit more buffer size. I can run lower than this as well, but I like to leave some room just for general use where I'm not worried about the absolute lowest latency possible. Even at this rate, it's extremely low. You get this reported in your DAW once you have things configured. And I have the clock source set to internal, and we'll get into this in a little more detail, but with an 8i6, we have the option for either internal or SPDIF. And that's really for when we're using outboard gear that's going to generate the clock. And again, more on that in part 2 of this tutorial using the Clarett Plus 8 Pre. Now I'll go ahead and I'll turn off that mixing setting, and we'll go ahead here into Focusrite Control itself. And when you look at Focusrite Control, you need to be aware of 2 things. There's an input settings tab and an output routing tab. So the input settings is what we'll take a look at first because it is the most basic and I get fewer questions about this. So in the case of the 8i6, it has two main preamp inputs. Again, depending on your interface, you may have one or more. Now, this allows me to do a few things. If I plug an XLR mic into the input, it knows it's a microphone, and then really the only option is if I want phantom power or not, and I can turn that on the interface itself. But if I plug in a jack, so a TRS jack, I have the option of having just that, a TRS for line input, or I can use a TS jack for instrument input. And what this does is it reconfigures the input depending on the impedance of what I'm using, because an instrument input like a guitar is going to be very different than a line in. So we need that configuration. By default, it'll be in line, but you can change it. Then there's an option for what's called air mode. And what this does is it allows your interface to emulate the performance of a Focusrite ISA preamp. And so what this will do is give you more presence in the sound, so a little bit of a boost in the higher end, which is great if you're using a darker microphone and you want a little extra clarity. I usually leave it off because I like to apply processing using either outboard gear or plugins. But nonetheless, that's available if you want a really simple way to get some additional clarity and presence in your microphone recordings. Then there's the option to control pad. And what this does is it simply provides a minus 10 dB offset to the signal coming in. And where this is useful is if you have a really hot signal coming in and it's causing your interface to clip even without having the gain turned up at all. This allows you to further turn it down, which will prevent you from getting clipping again on those hot sources. Now we'll take a look at the output routing tab. And what you need to know here is there are really three sections. There's all of the outputs where we can control what's being assigned to all the analog and digital outputs on the interface. And again, depending on which interface you'll either have more or fewer of these options. Then we have the hardware input section. And that again allows us to assign a fader to each of the hardware inputs, both analog and digital. And we have a limited number, again, depending on the interface you have, it will only allow you to assign a certain number of faders here. I'm using an 8i6, and even though there are 8 inputs, the maximum number of faders the mixer can handle is 6. So I need to select the ones that I want. I can also set these up as either stereo or mono. I'll get into that more when we do the actual setup from scratch. And then we have the software or DAW playback. And again, what that allows us to do is configure the playback of incoming sound, routing it to whatever output that we want. And really at the end of the day, again, it's hardware inputs processed to a certain output and software inputs, so from your computer, from your DAW, routed to specific outputs. Now, this is kind of a custom configuration that I have here, but what I'll do first is I'll go through some of the presets. So to get to the presets, we go to the File menu and choose Output Presets. And I'll first choose Direct Routing. And you'll see now with Direct Routing selected, this looks very different because all this does is route input for input. So we can see here right now, monitor 1 and 2 is selected, and it's telling me that here, software playback 1 and 2, so from our computer, is going to be output to monitor outputs 1 and 2. Those are typically where we'd expect our computer monitor speakers or our studio monitor speakers to be hooked up. Now, the other thing you need to know is that depending on the interface you have, this output will also be matched to your headphone output. So on the Scarlett 8i6, where I have headphone out 1 and 2, monitor outputs 1 and 2 are also always output to headphone output number 1 and 2. Now, if we look at the second output option here, which is line outputs 3 and 4, you'll see there's a headphone set there as well. And this is where it's a little confusing. I kind of feel that they should have headphones and speakers up here at number 1. But nonetheless, this is how they've done it. And in the case of outputs 3 and 4 on the Scarlett 8i6, the headphones going into jack number 2 are controlled the same as outputs 3 and 4. And of course, there's a TRS balance jack on the back of the interface for outputs 3 and 4. And the idea of this is that I can monitor 2 different mixes. Now, again, in direct output, all this is going to do is take the playback from channels 3 and 4 and put it directly into outputs 3 and 4. And so for me, this isn't a very useful application, But sometimes, it can be useful if you just simply want to have, input 1 goes to output 1, input 2, output 2, input 3, output 4, etc. And on the 8i6, outputs number 5 and 6 are actually a SPDIF, so they're a digital connection. And here again, we have playback 5 and 6. Those are the inputs from the computer playing back into SPDIF. So the only difference with this is that SPDIF are labeled 1 and 2 instead of 5 and 6. But again, overall, in terms of the inputs, if you were to look at the ASIO driver on your computer, for the 8i6, these SPDIF outputs would actually be labeled channels 5 and 6. And finally, the 8i6 gives you a loopback feature. And what's really useful about this is it allows us to take the outputs again from channel 1 and 2 on our computer and route it back to the inputs here on the Scarlett. And so what's really useful about that is if I want to record anything that's being output by programs on the computer, any applications, or I can use this to also loop those through additional gear for processing. And so that's the direct setup. The next output that you have or preset is called System Playback. And it's very similar, except here again, you can see we have channel 1 and 2, which is the regular audio output of your computer system, and also typically output 1 and 2 from your DAW. And it's going to output those to output number 1 and 2, which is again your studio monitors, as well as headphones plugged into the either interface plug-in number 1 for headphones. Your interface may have only one, so then that's what it'll be. Or if you have multiple headphone outputs, generally speaking, 1 and 2 are routed to headphone number 1. Then we get into the outputs 3 and 4, and here you can see the differences. Again, we're taking the regular playback from the computer, so outputs 1 and 2, and we're routing them to the line outputs 3 and 4, as well as headphone output 2 in the case of the Scarlett 8i6. And again, depending on if your interface has more than one headphone jack, you'll have different options. Then we have the SPDIF 1 and 2. And again, here we have just simply the audio playback from the computer being routed to the SPDIF outputs. And of course, the loopback is the same as before, where we have the software playback looping back to the inputs number 1. Now we'll take a look at the next preset, which is 2-channel analog. And if you think about this, this is basically just a 2-channel mixer and nothing more. So what we have here is for outputs number 1, we now have a fader for analog 1 and 2. Now on the Scarlett, we have 2 preamps. So that's what our faders are for here. If you have a solo, you'll have only 1. But if you have a 2i2, you'll have 2. And if you have a 4i4, 18i20, you'll also have 2 in the 2 analog setting. And so what this allows you to do is configure the output of those 2 preamps to go to the monitor output number 1 and 2. So if you want to have direct monitoring, this can be useful. You have options now on the faders here, and there's a few things allowed here. You have a mute button, so if you want to just make one silent without moving the fader around. It also has a solo button, so if you want to just solo that one input and have everything else muted, you can do that. And it also has what tells you where the setting is. And normally when these first come up, they're at 0, which is unity gain. You can adjust them by pushing them up and they will move up, or you can pull them down and you'll see it has a gradual move on mine. So what happens here is that it's gradually going to turn the sound up or down. And if you want to return it to unity gain, you just simply double click and it'll move it right back to 0. Beside that is what looks like an empty box, but that actually displays the peak input level. And so we have that coming in here. I'm actually not using input number 1 or 2 for this recording, so nothing is showing here, but we'll see more on that later. We get a fader for our DAW playback as well, and this can be configured. Right now I have it as playback 1 and 2. That's the standard that comes in the preset, but we can change that, and I'll show you that in the customization section. Then we get into the line outputs 3 and 4, and again, the same thing here. I have my basic analog 1 and 2 that are routed to those external outputs. And that can be useful if you have a second set of studio monitors you like to use, or if you're plugging your headphones into the second jack, or you have more than one set of headphones in use at the same time for monitoring with different people, and you want to all hear the same thing. And the same thing applies now here with SPDIF. we're going to just simply have 5 and 6 from the computer routed through to 5 and 6. Because this is a basic analog preset, it's really not doing anything to worry about SPDIF. And loopback, again, remains as software playback from the computer routed to number 1 and 2 on the inputs. So now I'll take a look at the next one here, and that is the digital. Now, because I'm using an 8i6, you'll see now that I actually show a SPDIF here coming through, and that's because the outboard channel strip that I'm using is connected into my device using both analog input 3 as well as the SPDIF digital connection. And so you're seeing the connection from my microphone here, and it's coming through on SPDIF channel 1 and 2. But this is digital. Where this is also useful is if we have more digital inputs. So in this case, really only one channel each on SPDIF, but we can have more. But again, this is the digital inputs as opposed to the analog inputs. It mirrors that on outputs 3 and 4. So again, the monitoring on all of channels 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the outputs is the same. And again, we have digital here where it's routing 5 and 6 back to 1 and 2. And the reason it says 5 and 6 is because on the computer, the SPDIF is set up as a 5 and 6 as the output. And again, we have loopback 1 to 2 and 1 to 2. Then we'll go ahead and take a look at analog plus digital. And so when we have analog plus digital, what's nice about this is it allows us to have, of course, all of our analog channels, but we can also go ahead and add in others. Now, on my 8i6, I simply have 6 analog inputs and 2 digital SPDIF inputs. But depending on your interface, you'll have more options there. And what's happening here is all of these are being routed, again, to the monitor output. Now, you also see here I've got analog 3 and 6. And that's because I have my patch bay configured that I have essentially hardware processing coming through on analog 3, but I have unprocessed preamp only external audio coming in on analog 6. I normally wouldn't have both of these on because it would actually create a vocal doubling. So I just go ahead and turn this down. But nonetheless, this is really about configuring what inputs we want to mix into output 1 and 2. The same thing applies on outputs 3 and 4. So we have all of our choice of analog inputs as well as our digital SPDIF inputs that we can monitor on output 3 and 4. And here's the part where it gets interesting, because if I go back to output 1 and 2, you'll see now that I really only have audio coming through from analog 3. I can turn the other ones down as well, but I don't have anything going in there right now. But you see, I don't have the unprocessed, the preamp only sound. But if I wanted to go through to my line outputs 3 and 4, and in this case I wanted to manage only my unprocessed sound, I can go ahead and turn off analog 3 on the fader and use analog 6 to output sound here. So now what I have is outputs 1 and 2 on the Scarlett are giving me my processed audio from analog 3, and my outputs 3 and 4 on the Scarlett are giving me my unprocessed external audio on analog channel 6. And of course, I have the options again, same things here. I can make them muted, I can solo them, I can be stereo or mono. Headphone monitoring, again, the same thing. If I plug my headphones into the jack number 2, I'm going to get the unprocessed audio monitored. If, on the other hand, I plug my headphones into headphone jack number 1, I will have the processed audio on analog 3 coming through. So this is the idea, again, of routing different audio for different monitoring purposes. This also continues to have the digital here. So the SPDIF, again, 5 and 6, which are the outputs for the SPDIF on the Scarlett 8i6, are routed back to SPDIF 1 and 2. And so really useful, again, in terms of if we want to move digital audio around. And then the loopback, again, remains with a DAW playback 1 and 2, essentially, into loopback 1 and 2. And again, depending on your interface, you will have different settings for this. Now, a couple more here that we have. Standalone preamp is a really interesting one. And basically, all that's happening with standalone preamp is it's taking the analog input that we plug into either number 1 or 2 on the Scarlett 8i6, and it's outputting that directly to a monitor output 1 and 2. And so this is really most useful when we're not using the Scarlett as an interface. We just want to use it as a preamp, and then maybe connect this into an amplifier of some kind. And so really this is the equivalent of having just a standalone preamp without the audio interface. And so we have 1 and 2 into outputs 1 and 2, analog 3 and 4 going directly to line outputs 3 and 4. All of these, again, will vary depending on the number of inputs and outputs you have on your interface. And then really SPDIF, although it's configured here for the outputs, there's nothing configured because this is a preamp only. And of course, loopback is also not configured because really all this is about is using the preamps from your interface to be able to get the sound, the sound into some type of amplifier or mixing board. Then we have finally the last preset here is empty. And this one is very useful if we want to start from scratch and build a selection of inputs and outputs for our mix. We can also start with one of the pre-existing presets and we can move them around and change them. And when we do that, we can go up into File and we have this what's called Save Snapshot. And that lets us actually save our configuration. But starting with an empty set here is a great way to configure exactly what you need based on your interface, other external hardware you might have, and the way you want to use your DAW. Now that I've gone through all the built-in presets and the configuration for the 8i6, and again, it'll be different depending on your interface, but the premise remains the same for each one. So whether it's a standalone preamp or a digital mixer or an analog mixer, it'll work the same way. But now let's go ahead and do a custom setup from scratch, starting with the empty preset. Okay, so to begin creating our customized mix, what we have to consider is what we really want to achieve. So we're going to start here with monitor outputs number 1 and 2. And again, these are generally the ones that your speakers are connected up to. So this is going to be for your monitors, but it's also going to be often for your headphone output plugged into channel 1. Again, this may vary depending on your interface. There is a table in your interface manual that tells you exactly which output channels go to which headphone jack. So you'll need to consult that. But for most people, output 1 and 2 is also going to be the headphone output on their interface. And if you have 2 outputs on the interface for headphones, 1 and 2 generally goes to headphones 1, and 3 and 4 generally goes to headphones number 2. So starting out with monitor 1 and 2, we have to decide what we want to actually go through our speakers. And so to add inputs, we just click this plus sign here, and it'll give us a table of all of the I/O on our device, at least as far as inputs are concerned. So for example, if I were to choose analog 3, that is the input that I in fact have my outboard preamp and channel strip going into, and you can see that it's there. Now, this actually will be going through my speakers as well as through my headphones, as long as I have them plugged into jack number 1 on the headphone jacks anyways. And so this means I can monitor in real time the audio coming through in my headphones before it goes through the computer. So this is all routed directly inside the interface. Of course, this hardware input 3 will show up as ASIO input 3 on the DAW. So if I wanted to record this, because I'm using analog 3, I would have to set up ASIO input number 3 in my DAW for the channel, or for the track rather, that I want to record. And so again, this is all about monitoring. So, if for example, I had, a number of things here, I had a couple of microphones hooked up on number 1 and 2, and I also had an instrument plugged in perhaps to number 4. Maybe I had a keyboard plugged into number 4, and then I had another external preamp into number 5 and into number 6. Now I have a full mixing board with analog inputs 1 through 6. And again, depending on your interface, you'll have either more or fewer of these. And what I can do is I can use this as a mixer to control the output of the various sounds. So, I can mix my vocals and my instruments all in one spot here for monitoring purposes through my headphones or through the speakers if this is in a separate control room. But what's really nice about this is I've now set up monitor outputs number 1 and 2. If I want to go into number 3 and 4, even if I'm not using external speakers, maybe I have, a musician or a singer that's listening to headphones through output number 2 on the headphone. So again, the 8i6 has 2 sets of headphone outputs. And so in that case, if all of these hardware inputs are being used for, say, a microphone and being used for instruments, well, quite often the singer doesn't want to hear themselves through the headphones. They just want to hear the rest of the mix. And so what can happen is I can just mute or turn down the input on where I have the microphone connected into. And so that's going to be very useful. Now, up until this is all live. This is all coming in via analog into the interface. I'm going to go back to number 1 and 2 because a lot of times we also want to have playback from our DAW coming through with the monitored mix. And that can be used, for overdubbing more than one track. And so what we do for that is the software DAW playback, we click the plus and we choose the channels. And for most cases, it's going to be 1 and 2 because the standard output or standard stereo output that most DAWs are configured with out of the box, if you will, is to output on 1 and 2. If you configure the output from your DAW to different channels, you can go ahead and choose them instead. In the case of the 8i6, I can only have one pair at a time. I can have 2 monaural. So if I don't have stereo and I actually have digital monaural sources, I can have 2 of them. But generally speaking, your playback from the DAW comes from channel 1 and 2 unless you've configured it otherwise. And so by doing this, anything I'm playing on the DAW will be monitored through to the monitor mix 1 and 2, which again will come out of the speakers, but will also come through headphones plugged into headphone output number 1. Very useful, again, if you are a singer and you are wearing a set of headphones and you don't want to hear anything, you can turn the volume down on that. In the case here, I would typically use monitor outputs 1 and 2 in headphones to hear the entire mix coming through. And then I would use outputs 3 and 4 to remove a particular instrument or vocals so that, whoever is using it, whether it's a musician or singer, can get the exact mix that they want. And so, sometimes, again, not all musicians or singers want to hear every part coming through simultaneously. So being able to mix those in and out is great. Beyond that, of course, since we have one mix coming from our DAW, if we want then to exclude a particular channel or particular track rather from our DAW, we have to mute that in the DAW so that it doesn't come through. But bear in mind then it will not come through the main monitor mix as well as the secondary monitor mix. So you need to know that. Now again, for customization, generally speaking, we're going to have, in the case of the Scarlett 8i6, number 5 and 6 are in fact assigned to SPDIF. And so those are connected directly, again, to the SPDIF outputs 1 and 2 are in fact outputs number 5 and 6 on the interface. And again, depending on how many outputs and inputs your interface has, these numbers may be different. Loopback remains the same, where really we're looping back the primary playback from our DAW or any other application on our PC back through number 1 and 2 so that we can apply processing or we can record that. And so that's, the basics for setting up the mixer to use customized input and output routing. And so again, we just need to consider what we want to listen to in real time in terms of the live analog sources or live digital sources. If I eliminate analog 5 and 6, for example, here, I could go ahead and add the stereo SPDIF in as a hardware input. So now anything connected into the SPDIF in on the 8i6 will be monitored through the main speakers I have connected up to monitor out. And that's really useful. That essentially is incorporating a DAC right into this mixer. So, if I have a digital source coming in by SPDIF, it'll convert it to analog so I can play it on my speakers. And, if all I wanted to do was a DAC, I could isolate this, and I'll show you that right at the end. But essentially, that's what we have here. And again, depending on your interface, you'll have a different number of available faders here on the mixer. So the idea is to put what you need here that you want to hear in real time. You can always mute the ones that you don't want to be having monitored directly in real time through speakers in particular, but also if you don't want to hear all of the audio sources through your headphones. But as far as the DAW is concerned, You could have 64 tracks on your DAW. Well, they're all going to come through Playback 1 and 2. So if you want to mute any of those, you need to make sure you set that up in the DAW itself. Now, I briefly mentioned using your interface as an outboard DAC so that you can listen to digital sources either through speakers or headphones. So I'll just quickly show you that setup. And so if you want to set your interface up to be used as a DAC, so you may have a direct source like a Blu-ray or a DVD or high-res audio, all you need to do is go ahead into the hardware inputs and add in the SPDIF. So we'll add in SPDIF 1 and 2. And again, it's showing here because I have my outboard channel strip that this microphone's connected into also coming in via digital connection. But again, if you want to use it as a DAC for listening to high-res audio or listening to other sources, again, like CD or DVD player, you can simply select SPDIF as your hardware input, and that will give you the output. Now, you'll also have options for optical, depending on the interface you have, or, of course, if your interface does not have a SPDIF connection, this will not be available. Now, another use case for being able to route inputs and outputs is to allow for the use of outboard processors. Now, I'll get into this more in the second part of this tutorial, but suffice to say that with an interface that has at least one additional set of outputs and inputs, you can actually go ahead and send audio out to an outboard processor like a compressor or an EQ, and then come back into another set of inputs, and that'll allow you to record processed audio from outboard gear into your DAW. Now, most DAWs expect you to use like number for like number. So input 3 with output 3, input 4 with output 4. Some will allow you to configure. This is different again depending on your DAW. So as a quick demonstration, I've actually gone ahead and set up another microphone on input number 1. So I'm using outputs 3 and 4 here because generally speaking for outboard gear, we need to use a different set of outputs or at least individual output versus our main monitor. So in the case of the 8i6, I have an additional 2 analog outputs available on output number 3 and output number 4. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll add in my first microphone. So and I'll add in number 3 as well, which is the one that you're actually hearing me on. So input number 1, I now have a second microphone connected up. And what this means is that I have essentially a microphone coming through preamp number 1 on my Scarlett interface. Now, I can record this directly into the DAW as ASIO input number 1. But if, for example, I want to have this go through an outboard processor, I can send this, in the case of this, it's going to be from output number 3, and I can send that out to one of my processors on output 3. And so what I'll do is I'll make sure in this case I wouldn't be sending any output from my Analogue 3. So now I would have only the unprocessed microphone that I have connected directly to the 8i6. It's going to go out of the Scarlett through output number 3. And so we'll have that sound from, again, input 1 going through output 3. Then what I will do is route that through my outboard processing device and come back into another input. And I can simply choose another input for that, whether it's analog or digital. And so if, say, I had it routed back into input number 5, well, then what I would do is I would record input number 5 in the DAW. Even though I'm going to get the audio from microphone input number 1, it's first going to go out to an outboard processor and then come back in through input number 5 with the processing, and I would then record that. So now that I have Focusrite Control configured to send the input from microphone channel 1, so preamp 1, through output number 3, and then what I've done is I actually have it patched in. Output 3 is going to one of my outboard processors and then coming back into input number 5 in the interface. And so I'll quickly load up a DAW and show you how I would record that. Okay, so now I've loaded up Studio One and I've just set up a basic multi-track recording here, tracks number 1 through 8. And that's so I have the inputs 1 through 8 from my Scarlett 8i6 assigned here. Again, you can configure this for instruments. It depends on your DAW, how you want to set this up, how many tracks you want to have. But for simplicity, I've just set up 8 here. And you may recall that we had a secondary microphone connected into number 1 on our Scarlett. And so that is coming in through number 1. And if I arm that track, we'll see that there is audio coming through there. But using Focusrite Control, I routed this audio out through output number 3 on the Scarlett and then back in through input number 5 on the Scarlett. So I have an outboard processor in between. And so if I go ahead and arm number 5, you'll see that I have that audio coming through there as well. And so right now, coming into my DAW, I have the original unprocessed mic through the preamp on the Scarlett, as well as the processed audio that's going through outboard processing. And so I can record that baked-in processing, and I can record the unprocessed audio, or just one or the other. But the idea here is I'm using the routing capabilities of Focusrite Control to allow me to insert an external processor. Now, that's only one way of doing it. The way I like to do it is actually in the DAW itself using insert functions. And I'll get into that more in the advanced video where we're using the Clarett Plus 8 Pre, and we have a few more inputs and outputs available. But I just wanted to show you one option for how to get this done. And now I've just opened up another instance of OBS because although a DAW will allow you to do hardware inserts directly without the need of Focusrite Control, it can be really useful to have that function when you have a platform like OBS that does not have that built-in capability. So if I want to use an outboard processor with OBS Studio, what I can in fact do is go ahead and set up my original input, which is the microphone number 1, and you'll see I've added an input number 5. I'll just move it down into my microphone so that it's together here. And the idea is that I have input 1 is directly from the Scarlett with the preamp. And again, using Focusrite Control, I've routed that through output number 3 and then back into input number 5. And what that's allowed me to do is then set up input 5 here in OBS. So I can now use outboard processing in OBS while still using the Scarlett as a preamp. So again, not a very common use case, but if you wanted to use an outboard processor, you can do that in a streaming application as well. The main application of Focusrite Control is for setting up monitoring mixes, because quite often we want to monitor some of the sources, but not all of them in real time. And when you have an interface like the 8i6 that has more than one headphone input, it allows you to set up different mixes so that perhaps you, if you're handling the recording, hear things a little differently than perhaps a musician or a singer does. And so it's most useful for that, but it can be used as a workaround if you need to add outboard gear where you don't have that as a built-in function like in most DAWs. In the advanced part 2 of this tutorial, I'll go through how to control digital sources like ADAT, SPDIF, as well as how to set up monitoring mixes for both live and recorded audio using Focusrite Control. We'll also get into the DAW. Again, I'll use Studio One, and I'll explain exactly how to configure all of the inputs and outputs within the DAW so that you can go ahead and create those mixes in your DAW as well as various recording buses. If you're interested in recording, streaming, audio, and video gear, check out one of the videos on the screen. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.